All right, so today I got to talk a little bit more about the whole conservative leadership race. Now, not as much my thoughts about the party and the leader in general, but in regards to this idea that Alberta and Saskatchewan are a bunch of racists. And this is something I've brought up before, and this is just more evidence that number one, it's not true, and number two, I think it proves my point even more that the left accusing people of whatever they tend to accuse people of, it's usually just a confession. And I think that's what a lot of these people do is that to not have a guilty conscience, they just accuse other people of doing it, right? The rather than especially when it comes to racism. You look at Trump as a prime example of this too. They have so many examples of this when it comes to Trump. First, it was he won't accept the results of the election, but who didn't accept the results of the election? Trump cheated. He colluded with Russia, but it turns out that not only did he not cheat or collude, the Obama administration was illegally spying on him, which just shows that the Democrats were cheating. So again, there's so many examples of this that the left accuses you of what they're guilty of. Now again, it's always not always true, but most of the time it seems like it is, and that's the problem. And same thing that comes with this whole racist thing too. And I don't know as much about Lewis personally. I think Sloan was the best. I think Lewis was the second best. McKay I think would have been a nightmare. I mean, he talked good about guns and whatnot, but I think if anything he would have moved the party even further to the left. He would have been a disaster. I don't think O'Toole's going to do much. I think he's going to keep the party pretty much where Scheer had it. I mean, I think there's maybe an argument that the Conservatives are more likely to win under O'Toole, but I think that's partially due to the fact that Trudeau is screwing up left, right, and center and doing whatever it takes to lose support. Now, will he lose enough? I don't know, because this is the problem: is that when it comes to the whole conservative thing, is that there's pretty much two arguments. Number one is actually be a principled conservative, which I think is the right way to go. I mean, if you're going to lose, at least lose with dignity. The problem is that the conservatives have went away from that, um, and they're now losing with no dignity. They've moved incredibly far to the left. Um, at least for conservatives, they're obviously not on the left. I think they're pretty much dead center if you look at them on a political spectrum. I think you could make an argument that they're actually slightly to the left of center. But again, it all depends on where O'Toole takes them. But the first thing to point out is that, sorry, the thing to point out is that um, I don't know if there's any way that the conservatives could beat the liberals right now, not because the ideas wouldn't be good. And this is the one thing that I think that I don't know. I don't. They probably believe this too, but the Maxime Berniers of the world is that if Maxime Bernier was conservative leader last election or even next election, I don't know if they would have won. And even if he got what he wanted through, like if he ran a platform similar to the PPC, I don't think they would have got elected. Not because they don't have the best ideas, but because there's so many brain dead, idiotic Canadians, and a lot of them they're just so susceptible to propaganda they go along with it. But given the rates of how high immigration is, just how bad the brainwashing is in schools and on the media, I don't think they would have won. So that's one of the reasons why I don't think that this matters that much. But the thing that does matter, like getting back to the main point here, is that Alberta and Saskatchewan are not a bunch of rednecks. And this is the other thing too, is that the left always gets offended when people on the right point out stereotypes, whether they're true or not. Let's just forget about that, because a lot of stereotypes that people get mad at you for, or people consider racist, they're true, right? And the only thing that makes a stereotype is that if it's not true, right? Like, a good example of a stereotype would be something like, um, I guess let's start from the other way around. A true example of a stereotype is, blacks are more likely to be criminals. Now, again, can you look at an individual black and assume he's a criminal? Absolutely not. And the fact that I have to point that out just goes to show just how ignorant the average person is. But nonetheless, is that pointing out something that is statistically true isn't a stereotype, because a stereotype is something that people generally believe to be true that isn't true, right? Like, the whole toxic masculinity thing, or whites are the most. Actually, this is a good example of a stereotype. Whites are the most racist race, or something along those lines, right? And that's something the left promulgates all the time. But if you look at the studies, well, whites are actually the least racist race, at least of the major ones. Um, Asians actually quite racist. I mean, you look at Japan and China. Do they have a lot of diversity there? Well, no, they don't. Mexico, they have it written in their constitution that they have to stay majority Hispanic again. So do they have a lot of I mean, they like the rich Americans and the rich Canadians coming there to holiday and during the winter. Yeah, they love that because it means money for their economy. But they have it written into their constitution that they want to say majority Hispanic. I mean, um, you look at the blacks as well. The blacks are more likely to be members of racial supremacist groups than whites are in the states, and I believe that's according to the Southern Poverty Law Center, or is it the ADL? One of those two. Even though they're both far left organizations, they both basically admit that. So again, the idea of whites being the most racist, and this is the other thing too when it comes to Alberta and Saskatchewan. I mean, you have a lot of people from the east, and a lot of people, especially the people that live in the cities in Edmonton. I see this a lot, or at least I've heard this enough that it bothers me. Is, oh yeah, you're from rural Alberta, you're a bunch of hicks, but that stuff does exist to an extent, but the one thing to point out is that the stereotype of those people being racist and all that kind of stuff is largely not true. Like, largely not true. Like, and here's the thing, too, is that growing up in rural Alberta, I can tell you for a fact there is some racist people, but the racism you tend to hear from people in rural Alberta is like racist jokes, like, making fun of natives and that kind of stuff. But although that is, racist to an extent, the racism we really need to be worried about in society is the people that make it a point in their day-to-day life to make the lives of other races worse. Like, those are the racists we really need to be worried about, not people who joke around. Which again, I'm not a big fan of that, but those people aren't the worst people in the world. And not to mention, half those people don't even believe that kind of stuff. So, but I've heard stuff in this. I've heard stuff in the cities that's far worse. I mean, I've heard stuff in the cities that people, oh yeah, we support the whole racial quota hiring, and we support, some of this segregation talk that's coming back up, and the segregation talk isn't coming from the hicks from rural Alberta and Saskatchewan. It's coming from the people in the cities that live in echo chambers and support this kind of stuff. It's coming from the left. So that's kind of the point I wanted to get across is um, the idea that Alberta and Saskatchewan, specifically the people from the rural areas, are, oh, they're a bunch of racists. No, they're really not. There is some of them, but I believe that when you hear people accuse other people of stuff without evidence, you kind of have to assume that they're projecting, at least to some extent. And the reason for that isn't just me talking off a whim, like I said. There's a lot of evidence that backs that up. There is a lot of evidence that backs that up. Like I say, the fact that the left accuses the right of so many things, that they are as guilty or more guilty than the right on. So many things. I mean, you look at Justin Trudeau with, oh, I'm helping all the blacks, and no, I'm so against racism, and all he does is get up there and virtue signal all day long, but yet wore blackface multiple times, white privilege, all this garbage that he goes on about, systemic racism. Like, does racism exist to some degree in Canada? Absolutely. Did it exist in the past? Absolutely. But is it this terrible thing that's like the biggest issue we should be worried about? Absolutely not. And the reason we know that, like I pointed out for, a lot, is that a lot of these cases of quote unquote racism they point to isn't racism, because they'll point to a case of, oh, well, George Floyd, or the guy in Fort McMurray. Well, just because um, a white person or the cops go after a black person or a native or whatever doesn't prove racism. It doesn't. And this is the other reason why we know the left is a bunch of racist, or at the very least more likely to be racist. I wouldn't say they're all racist, or the majority even is, but they assume that if a white cop kills a black man, it must be racism. If someone, flips off a black person, or, yells at him for no reason. It must be racism. Like we seen that guy in the liquor store in Edmonton a while back. Talking about the I don't know who he was going down on, but oh, it must be racism. Like, no, why do you assume? Why do you assume? There is no evidence that points towards George Floyd being a racist incident, even though he didn't die from the cops, he died of a drug overdose. There is no evidence of the whole Jacob Blake thing being racism. Why do we assume that that's the case? Now, again, if there's proof that these officers were posting racist stuff on social media, and this is the thing too, criticizing BLM is not racist too. I've seen people post this on social media of, oh, I know a cop who's critical of BLM. Therefore he's a racist and he should be fired. No, anybody with half a damn brain is critical of BLM. Anyone with half a brain. So this is the thing. Um, I guess to sum it up here, the big problem is that so much in society these days of stuff that's thought to be racist isn't racist, and so much of the stuff that is racist, which I don't even think it's that big of a deal. I think the fact that the only ways that people can legally discriminate these days is largely against whites and Asians, and and specifically in favor of blacks and natives and whatnot in Canada. The fact that those are the only actual legal ways to discriminate just goes to show that we should be more worried about that than we should be, literally a handful of unarmed blacks that are killed every year in the States. Canada, you could probably literally count them on one hand. And that's the thing, too, is that this is such a Now, should we have justice for the people that legitimately are victims of police brutality? Absolutely. I've never said I'm not in favor of police reform to some extent, but the big problem we have is the left thinks that policing needs to be radically transformed. It needs like top down change, but no, it just needs a little bit of tinkering. We need to improve things a little bit. They don't need to change that much. And should bad cops be punished? Absolutely. But the problem is that the left thinks that a cop that defends himself from a violent criminal with a weapon should be charged for that. No, that's complete BS. So anyway, I kind of jumped around topics here a little bit, but again, the main point being is that Alberta and Saskatchewan not any more racist than the average province. If anything, less racist. So again, that's just something I wanted to point out. So anyway, if you liked the video, make sure you hit that like and subscribe if you haven't already. Make sure you check me out on Twitter, BitChute, and Parler. All those links are in the description, so make sure you check me out there. Make sure you follow me on all the platforms. Very important you do that. So stay tuned for more.